Hi, everyone. Good afternoon from Berlin. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm really happy to be talking to you today about work that I've been doing over the past few years. And in a way, it's an attempt to bring together different streams of work that I've done. So, on the one hand, I'm going to be talking about artificial intelligence, AI, and technologies that are construed as being AI. And I also want to talk about work I used to do before, or rather, some of the political questions and concerns that are associated with gender and feminism, with questions of the digital freedom of speech and expression. We tend to find that these two worlds of future, exciting future technologies like AI are quite separate from conditions of the earth, the planetary, protest movements, and digital politics. And what I'm trying to do in my work is to ask, why are these two things kept separate and how can they be brought closer together? And when they are brought closer together, what happens then? How does one start to change because of the other? So this talk has three parts to it. The first is the digital and political conditions of the earth that I think need to be part of all our discussions of technology. The second is the notion of the human and the changing and shifting notions of the human. And the third is the question of how we envision the future. Beauty blooms even as the world is trying to break my spirit. This is an email that I got from a friend of mine recently, an old friend. And even though, it's the pandemic and she made no mention to the pandemic, but I really love how she talked about beauty blooming even at this time. And for some reason, it took me back to Delhi, where for the second year in a row, the people of India have gathered to resist and protest the Modi government's fascist violence. And last year, before the pandemic struck, before the lockdown, people had gathered in different parts of the country, and especially in Delhi, in an area called Shaheen Bagh, to resist the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens that the Modi government was going to bring in and proposing to bring in. And effectively, what they were going to do with this law was to propose that Indian Muslims are not Indian. And this is part of a long project of the Hindu right and Modi's government to strip many Indians, Muslims, as well as Dalits, Bahujans, and Adivasis of cultural, social, political, economic, and human rights. And what we saw in those months before the pandemic was an amazing set of protest movements of people saying, no, you're not going to classify us and categorize us in this way. And we know all about national registers of citizens. Hitler had one, Donald Trump tried to bring in a national register of Muslims. And there's a very particular way that digital technology comes into this. But even long before digital technologies, humans have always been categorizing and identifying one as more or less human. And then there's another show, a scene from Delhi more recently, of farmers from around the country and particularly from Punjab and Haryana camped out for more than 3 months. Farmers are resisting the new farm laws proposed by Narendra Modi's government, through which, if passed, will end up making farmers' incomes and livelihoods unstable and untenable, and corporate-owned agribusinesses will take control of their properties, but also determine their outputs. International awareness of the farmers' protests was sparked off by tweets by Rihanna and Greta Thunberg, caused great concern for the Indian government, who thought that they were going to be destabilized by Rihanna's tweets. What they did was they targeted a young woman activist, a climate change activist from Kerala called Disha Ravi, for being in contact with Greta Thunberg and for being a climate change activist. I feel like the bodies of Disha, the bodies of young women who continue to be detained and arrested in India for speaking out against the fascist government, as they are in many different parts of the world, somehow these bodies and the politics that they represent cannot be separate from the conversations about digital technologies that we're talking about today. So this is all happening in a country that presents itself as being a lab or a garage of AI. And I mean this metaphorically. In a study of metaphors that I did recently and which I want to talk about next, India thinks of itself as a hub, a lab, or a garage for AI. And all the while, farmers are fighting for their lives and livelihoods. AI is being proposed as an application in agriculture to help farmers fight pests. It's really ironic. So we need to develop a different understanding of AI in terms of its multiple realities in these different contexts that somehow it seems to be disconnected to. And what it is connected to is a very narrow conception of the human and human intelligence. A lot of this also comes from places like Hollywood and particular North Atlantic traditions of cinema and history, or Japan as well. And so what I did recently was I was curious about the different metaphors that we have of artificial intelligence in different parts of the world. So metaphors are really interesting because they allow us to convey things that we don't quite understand, sometimes in terms of scale or just because they're very uncertain. And metaphors sort of occupy the space between the known and the unknown, and hence allow us to apprehend uncertainty. But the paradox or the sort of problem is that metaphors sort of constitute this uncertainty and this uncertain future, but they occlude our ability to actually see that future in its entirety and outside of the metaphors that we have for it. So there's a very intimate and complex relationship between knowledge and knowing and knowledge production. And this plays out a lot in science and technology in particular, where we're constantly making discoveries or inventing things that we don't always quite understand. So metaphors allow us to come to terms with the new before we even have an appreciation of its affordances. So there are common metaphors that we use in technology that you're familiar with, like information wants to be free, or data is the new oil. And we have cybersecurity is often framed in terms of invasion or bodily health or burglary. When it comes to addiction and detoxing, we use addiction and detoxing and food metaphors a lot to describe our struggles with disconnecting from the attention economy. And AI is itself already a metaphor of human intelligence, and the computer and brain are so closely entangled as metaphors of each other that it's practically impossible now to disentangle them, I think. But what's interesting about metaphors is that they always carry the social fingerprints of who makes them and where they come from. And this is what the feminist epistemologist Sandra Harding says about metaphors. So in this global survey, or well, it wasn't entirely global, but kind of a regional survey that I did of AI metaphors, I want to just focus on two for a moment, and particularly thinking about Africa and India. And what I found was that politicians and bureaucrats enabled by business are very enthusiastic about AI as something that will allow us to leapfrog the present and go to this future which lies on some kind of straight path somewhere ahead. So AI is like a train that we can't miss and must jump on if we want to get to this future. And what lies in that future is a country in Africa or a place in India that has no problems like hunger or poverty. And rather than politicians and bureaucrats actually solving those problems, there is this technological solutionism that we've seen with a lot of other technologies as well. AI is not the first, and unfortunately maybe not even the last time that we see this sort of pinning hopes on technology solving our sort of very intractable social problems. So I remember that whether it was video, new media, big data, mobile phones, and now AI, these are technologies that will allow us to leap beyond problems such as hunger and poverty. But what kinds of new language of AI will we develop to capture the realities of a Shaheen Bagh or of Delhi and the Tigri border where farmers are camped out? So there's a new project in development called a new AI lexicon by Nupur Raval and Amba Kak at the AI Now Institute. They're trying to do this. They're trying to come up with a new language to talk about concerns outside the West. They say there is an urgent need to expand and revise critical AI thinking by attending to global racial histories, diverse queer movements, struggles of caste and tribal communities, and their specific place-based demands, especially outside of the West. We need a more expansive stock-taking of race and gender relations, they say, as well as the variegated forms of marginalization globally. Which brings me to this idea of humans and machines, and the human as the template for AI. And why I think we must be suspicious of this idea, or this sort of connection between AI and the human. I want to focus for a little bit on Sylvia Wynter's work as a guide to understanding this narrative of AI and humans, and especially since AI is sort of imagined in terms of humanoid robots or some kind of super intelligence that's going to erase humanity. And Wynter has this great idea of homo narrans, the human that continuously reinvents and reproduces itself through storytelling. She says that bios is our human identity. It's essentially biological and biologically determined. And this is our mythology. And this mythology of human biology runs through the most compelling and dominant kind of storytelling we have, science. So Homo sapiens, also Homo narrans, emerges as a champion, edging out Homo neanderthalis by standing fully upright, making astonishing use of its opposable thumbs to design fascinating tools, and enabled by prodigious expression and communication skills, and developing elaborate biosocial systems to care for the young. And this is now a direct quote from Wynter talking to Catherine McKittrick. Our mythoi, our origin stories, are therefore always formulaically patterned so as to co-function with the endogenous neurochemical behavior of our human brains. Humans then are a biomutationally evolved hybrid species, storytellers who are now storytellingly inventing themselves as being purely biological. But Wynter finds that Homo narrans is an unreliable narrator. For example, its storytelling through pseudosciences such as eugenics identifies some humans as inferior or deviant because of the size of their brains, the shape of their eyes and ears, the color of their skin, how their faces register emotions, or how high or low their hairlines sit. And this idea of the human, as much as it is established in sciences such as physiognomy and eugenics, or pseudosciences rather, has also been an unstable category. So I was reading this book by Simon Winchester about land ownership, and he was curious about how and when humans decided that they could start owning land. And he tells the story in this book about the settling of the United States, and how when the first settlers got there, indigenous people who were already there did not think of themselves as owning the land, they just lived on it and they were of it. So they were classified as wildlife, because if wildlife doesn't own land, wildlife is just on and off the land. So the settler then is not taking away somebody's land. And then there's the dehumanization of Muslims and Dalits in India, the high degrees of surveillance and violence against Black people in the United States. And I recently learned that when a sex worker is killed in the United States, the police will actually use this abbreviation NHI, which means no humans involved. And that was very upsetting to discover. So you have this situation where, on the one hand, we think we know what the human is, but actually its boundaries are constantly being drawn and redrawn. And Amanda Rees and Charlotte Slee write in their book, The Human, that the human is a category of multiple origins and tends to be defined by many things, almost all of them what it is not. Thus, a cultural history of Western civilization might be told through its vociferous defense of the human as not an alien, not a machine, female, wildlife, hominin, animal, an enslaved person, or a Black person. So how might AI be a moment to reorient our attention to what these benchmarks and boundaries do and propose different uses of them? And in thinking about the future and future technologies, I want to look at this amazing project called the Oracle for Transfeminist Technologies. And this is a project by Joanna Varon and Sasha Costanza-Chock, and coding rights It's a really beautiful card game that acts as a sort of provocation and set of prompts, a bit like a tarot deck, you might say. And they write that this oracle is a hands-on card deck designed to help us collectively envision and share ideas for trans feminist technologies from the future. So you have, for example, these 4 suits. So you have situations, you have objects, you have people and places, and you have values. And so how you would play the game, I guess in a workshop scenario, usually is you pick a card like situation, diffuse power and diversify governance. You pick a value like open source. You pick an object, bicycle, and you pick people and places. Be in your own body, be in the place you inhabit. Now, if you were to put these things together, what kind of prompt what kind of prompt would it work as? And kind of thinking about the different kinds of material realities and bodies and political situations that we don't bring together, but actually are all part of our interconnected world. From this place, then, how will we start to imagine the future with technology? And how will amazing scholars and designers and artists like yourselves start imagining it? I want to have this conversation with you when we meet again. Till then, thank you so much.